very much for coming. And they say one should never discuss politics or religion in polite society. And I can see there is no society more polite than the one gathered here tonight. So I will do my best to walk on eggshells, not to talk about politics, although it'll be difficult in the current circumstances. And I might even try not to talk about religion too. But in questions, we might have a bit of fun with all of that. I'm also told that the Royal Thames Yacht Club is not a party political organisation. And I should not mention any recognisable political party, which is just as well, because as a Conservative backbencher, I no longer belong to any recognisable political party. So people often ask, what's it like in the House of Lords? And over the next 3.5 hours, I'm going to try briefly to describe what it is. If I had to boil it down to its 3 essentials, I would say there are 3 very positive aspects of the House of Lords and 1 moderately negative one. The positive one, the main positive one, is working in one of the most famous and glorious buildings in the world, certainly one of the most photographed and filmed. And it is as magnificently splendid and Gothic inside as it is outside. I still pinch myself walking down the red carpeted corridors of the House of Lords or the green carpeted corridors of the House of Commons, or eating in one of the beautifully decorated wood-panelled committee rooms, or eating in one of the ornately decorated dining rooms. Related to this, the second plus is the sense of continuing to be a part of world history, going back to the English Great Council of the 10th century and the first English Parliament, the so-called Model Parliament of 1295, which was composed of archbishops and bishops, earls and barons, and representatives from the shires and boroughs, so not really too dissimilar to what we have now. Modern parliamentary democracy and the subsequent model of parliaments is in many ways Britain's governance gift to the world, and something of which I think we can all be proud. The third main plus of working there is knowing that we represent wonderful value for money for the taxpayer. Doubly satisfying when we see so much public money being wasted right in front of our eyes all the time. The whole place is really run on a shoestring, to the extent that 1/3 of the government ministers aren't paid at all. Our out-of-town members have to subsidise their own overnight expenses. A lot of our parliamentary work is unpaid, and none of us receive any welfare benefits at all. I'm not complaining, I'm just saying how it is. The negative part of working there relates solely to the antisocial hours. We don't normally start until 2:30 or 3 in the afternoon and regularly go on till 10 o'clock at night, and often to midnight, and occasionally into the small hours. This is made worse by Lord's parliamentary business constantly shifting around as we react to events in the Commons, which is our main function. So any evening or nighttime social life is absolutely impossible while Parliament is sitting. We can talk all about these later in questions if anyone's interested, but I'd like to get down to the bones of how it actually works and what it does, which basically means how it interacts with the House of Commons and the Sovereign. So let's look at the composition of the House, then how one becomes a peer. And when I say peer, I also mean peeresses, but we're not going to say peeresses anymore, but I don't know why. But anyway, peer means peeresses as well. Then what we do, and then how we could do it better, perhaps. So the composition of the House. I think that the sheer number of peers is seen to be an issue, because although most commentators recognise that we are the least expensive second chamber in the world, we are also the most numerous. And at nearly 800 members, we are second only to the National People's Congress of China. But actually, when you drill down into the figures, about half the peers never come, because they are celebrity peers rather than political peers. And this is an unfortunate part of the honours system, that just because one is made a peer doesn't necessarily mean one sits in the House of Lords. So, for example, we very seldom, if ever, see Alan Sugar or Julian Fellows or David Putnam or Ian Botham or Geoffrey Archer, to name just a few. And recently Andrew Lloyd Webber was good enough to give up his peerage on the basis that he simply never took part. For day-to-day business, we are around 350 working peers. So that is considerably fewer working peers than working MPs. Recently, there's been a move to make celebrities into dames and knights rather than peers, to correct this false impression. But obviously these things take time to filter through. Talking of taking time to filter through, there was also a major move to introduce more women and those from ethnic minority backgrounds. Currently, about 30% of us are baronesses, which doesn't sound a lot, but not long ago there were none. And every year that percentage increases. So not to put too fine a point on it, when some old white boy dies or retires, their place is taken on purpose, more often than not, by a woman or someone of ethnic diversity. In fact, I'm told that in terms of ethnic diversity, we are now at the national average. So that's one mission accomplished. So at the moment, we are 800 theoreticals, and they are 278 conservatives, 220 crossbenchers and independents, we'll come back to them in a minute, 174 Labour, 80 Lib Dems, 26 bishops, 8 from the various Northern Ireland parties, 2 Greens, 2 Plaid Cymru's, and none, thank heavens, from the SNP or Sinn Féin, who don't take part on principle in what they see as an English Parliament. So to use a recent example of just how rampant this non-attendance is, for the Rwanda bill last month, all parties were subject to a 3-line whip. And a 3-line whip means that whatever you're doing, stop it. Fly home from wherever you are. If you're in hospital, discharge yourself. Whatever it is, you've got to be there because every vote counts. So in spite of this 3-line whip, only just under 500 of the 800 attended, including some peers no one's ever seen before. So, for example, out of the nominal 278 Conservatives, only 208 responded to the 3-line whip, and out of the 174 Labour peers, only 128 did so. The other aspect of the 3-line whip is that MPs and peers have to vote under instruction, so not by what they think is for the best. So, for example, on Rwanda, we had very good reasons from extremely learned legal opinion that it was never going to work because the government didn't make it lawyer-proof. As a result, the vast majority of us voted for it, even though we knew it was doomed to failure. And by the way, the late realization that they were right all along is one of the 3 main reasons why we're having the general election now and not at the end of October. You will have noticed that the second largest group, and actually by far the most influential and respected on the ground, are the crossbenchers and independents, who by definition don't belong to any party and are not subject to whipping. We therefore have an inbuilt mass of floating voters. And what this means is that whoever is in government is always in a minority, which is a very good thing for checks and balances. If the governing party has all the other parties aligned against it, bearing in mind the warring factions within and between the parties, one can be certain that the governing party is proposing something unworkable. Of the other parties, I mentioned the Lib Dems at 80 peers are disproportionately high to their number of MPs, and this is because going back to the days of the coalition, Nick Clegg and David Cameron trawled around the country for more or less unemployable local councillors and made them peers to even up the numbers. The bishops and archbishops at 26 are the other sizable block, and they always, as a matter of principle, vote against the Conservative government no matter what it is proposing. They have really ceased to have any spiritual function and are now representative of the social worker mentality, not that there's anything wrong with social workers. In return, many undecided peers from all parties, as a matter of principle, vote against the bishops. In fact, if we're undecided on which way to vote, the great rule is to vote with the crossbenchers and against the bishops. So next we're going to look at how to become a peer, how to become a member of the House of Lords. There are three main routes: either political appointees or selection by the House of Lords Appointments Commission, or as one of the hereditaries or bishops sitting as there by right. To start with the political appointees, visitors to the House of Lords are always amazed to see so many familiar faces they haven't seen for a long time on television, because it's almost automatic that any politician who was a Chancellor of the Exchequer or Home Secretary or Foreign Secretary will automatically be offered anyway a seat in the House of Lords. And the same applies to senior MPs as well as academics from the leading left and right-leaning think tanks, as indeed are major donors from all parties. Now, as we know, this normally attracts poor publicity, but the alternative to parties being funded by donors is for them to be funded by the taxpayer. And I think that would attract even worse publicity and be open to all kinds of unforeseen consequences. Secondly, the House of Lords Appointment Commission's task is to find crossbench peers and vet applications for life peers. Anyone can apply to be a life peer, many do, but only very few are chosen, because the typical target for the Appointments Commission is someone who's recently retired from the head of one of the armed services, or the judiciary, or the diplomatic service, or academia, someone who's had some serious senior level service in public life. The crossbenchers are really the strength of the House of Lords. Senior figures from public service who bring impartial, non-political advice to pretty much any area of public life. At the end of last year, we had a debate on internal security, and we had crossbench contributions from the ex-head of MI5 and MI6, the recently retired ambassador to Washington, the ex-head of the ex-general secretary from NATO, a recently retired army chief of staff, as well as many many peers who take a particular interest in the subject. So the third way to the House of Lords is by being one of the bishops or hereditaries, 92 hereditaries. I've mentioned briefly the bishops, but hereditaries, as we're called, are ironically chosen in the most democratic way possible by proportional representation in a secret ballot. Thus, the hereditaries are, ironically, the only democratically elected members of the House of Lords. It's very difficult to be elected as a hereditary, because there are often 20 or so applicants for every vacancy, and the selection process is extremely thorough. So we have a situation where the 92 are disproportionately represented amongst the whips and ministers, and they are amongst the most diligent of backbenchers. This is because the selection process weeds out the amateurs, and we are all aware of a sense of extreme good fortune and sense of duty of still being there, although the process is unlikely to survive the incoming Labour administration. So next I'd like to talk about what we do. And in 3 words, we revise legislation. A piece of legislation that is still open to debate is called a bill, and when it's received royal assent and becomes law, it's called an act. So really our job is to turn bills into acts, to be a kind of staging post between the House of Commons and the Sovereign. So our job is to scrutinise legislation that the House of Commons proposes, and to make suggestions called amendments on how they can be improved. It is emphatically not to reject legislation proposed by the elected House of Commons. And this is a very important point, drilled into us right from the beginning, the primacy of the House of Commons. Although we're called the upper chamber, we are very much the second chamber in terms of influence. If we cannot ultimately agree on these amendments going backwards and forwards, which is called ping pong, ultimately the House of Commons will overrule our objections after three times. But having said that, the House of Commons usually accepts about 80% of the House of Lords amendments. and then send the 20% back with some sort of hint of compromise. And that's quite often the end of it. Occasionally, there's a second round of ping pong where compromises are made, and very occasionally a third round where there is no agreement and the House of Commons has the final say. It is very unusual. It's only happened 4 times. The last time it was in 1999 about fox hunting. But actually, it really wasn't about fox hunting at all. It was about changes to the constitution to the House of Lords, and the poor old foxes just happened to get in the way. An important part of the way we revise legislation is that each of us will have a speciality which we bring to bear on any particular subject. I was elected because I write and publish books on the visual arts and cultural history. So I know a lot about that particular subject, the media and culture, but I know very little about defence or the law or economics or farming or tourism or pretty much anything else. But there are plenty of others who do. Therefore, when legislation arrives from the Commons, which involves the media or culture, I get heavily involved in it, as do about 50 other peers with similar knowledge. And the same can be said about all the other different areas of specialisation. Spinning off from this will be our individual hobby horses or campaigns in which we take a special interest relating to our area of specialisation. For example, as a backbencher, I've become something of an anti-woke troublemaker. And I started and run the Fierce Free Speech Peers WhatsApp group. I'm heavily involved in gender-critical feminism, very skeptical about the science and economics behind net zero and the supranational ambitions of the World Health Organization. I also take a keen interest in motorsports and maritime, as these are subjects close to my heart and which I know a little bit about. As an example, I'm a member of the Commons and Lords Pipes and Cigars Enjoyment Club. And we had started to draft amendments to have cigars and hubbly-bubbly tobacco exempted from the forthcoming vaping bill. That particular died with the call to the general election, but I believe Labour will revive it, so we will keep on it and suggest amendments on another day. If anyone is interested for the legislation, for the amendments, I defined a cigar as having a minimum of 40 gauge and a minimum length of 4 5/8 inches, which is equivalent to a Romeo and Juliet number 3. Anything less than that is close, but no cigar. Whatever the outcome of the forthcoming election, those of us who have to revise legislation hope that the winning party doesn't enjoy the large majority the current one did, and to some extent still does. The reason for this is a party with a large majority can just shortcut parliamentary procedures and impose guillotines on debates, so new legislation is not considered properly and rushed through with amendments sent up to the House of Lords to sort out. So in the last session prior to the King's speech, over 8,000 amendments had to be tabled in the House of Lords. And we go through each one of them seriously, line by line, often to the middle of the night and beyond, which is why the House of Lords sits so much later than the House of Commons. The government itself imposed 2,500 of its own amendments in the House of Lords, which should all have been done properly in the House of Commons in the first place, if they haven't imposed time restraints and guillotines on debates. Part of the problem of the executive having too much power, as it now does, is that there are too many ministers. And the only real reason for that is that once an MP is on the ministerial payroll, he or she is far more likely to be loyal to the executive than if they were independent backbenchers. For example, the Department of Transport, when it included British Airways and British Railways, both state-owned and needing to be privatised, and things like the highway, before the Highways Agency, and all the other areas of transport. All of this was work done by 2 ministers, Kenneth Clarke and Norman Fowler. And now there are 5 ministers in the Department of Transport with very little to do compared to what happened before, mainly because most executive functions have been outsourced to arm's length bodies and quangos. And this is the reason why across all areas of government and public life, nothing works anymore. Or take the DHSS, which had 5 ministers and now has 12. In total, there are 95 ministers in the House of Commons compared to 19 in the House of Lords. And the ones in the Commons use up the vast majority of the ministerial budget, which means that 1/3 of the ministers in the House of Lords are unpaid. In fact, there are no paid ministers of state in the House of Lords, and one of them was forced to take a demotion to be a parliamentary Under-Secretary of State in order to be paid. And surely it can't be right that only those with independent means can afford to be ministers, but that's the situation we've got ourselves into. And being a minister at the dispatch box in the House of Lords is a far more daunting task than being a minister at the dispatch box in the House of Commons. The reason is that debates in the House of Commons are rowdy affairs with lots of yah-boo-sucks and addressed to an audience of other MPs who may know practically nothing about the subject in hand. In the House of Lords, debates are held in complete silence and with almost over-politeness, and the minister at the dispatch box will be addressing an audience of peers, many of whom will know considerably more about the matter in hand than the minister. And lastly, parallel to revising legislation, we also have special select committees, which look into various different aspects of public life. Everything from AI weapons systems to fat in diet, to intergenerational fairness, to modern slavery, constitution, foreign affairs, and all points in between. These committees are typically composed of about 12 to 20 members from all the parties and report over between 1 and 3 years, having interviewed loads of expert witnesses. And then they make suggestions to the government, which then often become government policy. But it's not all work and no play, because there's a tremendous amount of evening entertaining going on across the parliamentary estate, because MPs and peers often belong to non-parliamentary groups, societies, and clubs, and it's a favourite venue to host these events. For example, last summer, as part of our friendly arrangement with this yacht club, members of our yacht club entertained your Cumberland Cup visitors, and several of our members gave them a guided tour of the Palace of Westminster, and are very happy to do so again when they visit again next year. So lastly, how are we doing? Okay. Lastly, before questions, if there are any, let's consider how the House of Lords could be improved, how it could be reformed, and how we could do it better. The obvious candidate is to have elected rather than appointed members. I think a better option, and a far less obvious one, is to have professional rather than amateur members. But let's look at the pros and cons of each. The obvious pro of having elected members is that the House would be far more democratic. But from there on in, it's pretty much all downhill. For a start, we would end up with more politicians, which may or may not be a blessing. It also means there would have to be a third house anyway, whose job would now be to revise the legislation of 2 houses, the existing House of Commons and the newly elected House of Lords. So we would, in effect, have a renamed House of Lords anyway. And then there is the cost of all this. Elected members are far more expensive than appointed ones. At the moment, we are each paid by either the half day or full day, but this is only paid when the House is sitting, so typically about 130 days a year. With the expected 6 weeks hiatus between the now and the general election, this year we'll probably only sit for 90 days. So it's a very part-time and inexpensive arrangement. A great misunderstanding is that our pay is tax-free. It's not tax-free, it's tax-paid. And this is because we are encouraged to have other jobs, and we sit so seldom that most of us need other jobs. And the idea is that we bring that working expertise to the House of Lords. We're not allowed any staff costs, so we have to rely on lobbyists and pressure groups to do our drafting and research, which is hardly satisfactory, but that's the way it is. I mention all this because it has been calculated that each peer costs the taxpayer £30,000 a year, whereas each MP, by the time you've added in their salary, their staff costs, their pensions, their very generous redundancy, everything else costs £300,000 a year. So you have 10 peers for every one MP. To have an elected second chamber would surely logically increase the cost tenfold. And we still need to consider the cost of keeping the lower paid advisory chamber. And there is absolutely no evidence that the public has any appetite for spending more on politicians than they do already. A further disadvantage of an elected chamber is that one would lose all the expertise that currently resides in the House of Lords. If I had to stand for election, all I could do was knock on doors and say, please vote for me, I'm really good at revising legislation. And that's just me as a lowly backbencher. Imagine all those ex-judges and admirals and academics canvassing for votes. It's just not going to happen. And we'd be exchanging all that experience and expertise for people who may not even be able to run a bath. But possibly the major disadvantage of an elected House of Lords is that it would create a parliamentary logjam, equivalent to we see in the United States and other countries with two elected chambers, which makes me very confident that it's never going to happen, because MPs would never in a million years vote to lose their primacy. And it does kind of work, possibly in spite of rather than because of itself, and partly because the parliamentary system has evolved over centuries to bring about what we have now without causing any major revolutions or disruptions, which has not always been the case elsewhere. Now, if we look at the amateur versus professional argument, at the moment we're a part-time House paying part-time wages to part-time legislators. The advantage to the taxpayer is clear. The disadvantage is the expectation that we are professionals when we are in fact by design amateurs. Again, I think confronted with the cost of having us become professional with all that entails, the taxpayer would not be too impressed, although in all fairness, the taxpayer has never been asked. I think the biggest area of improvement would be how we appoint new members. As someone who's been through the election and selection process, I think it would be an excellent solution to use this as a template for all new appointees, not just hereditary ones. In this case, all members of the House of Lords will be elected, but be elected by their fellow peers. So all attempts at reform in the past have failed because no one can agree on what it should be. And I suspect we will continue to muddle along as we are now, all very British and in many ways none the worse for that. In the meantime, I for one will never forget how incredibly lucky I am to be doing what I am doing, and rest assured will continue to do so to the best of my abilities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ian. I'm sure we're going to have some questions, so please, here we are. First question.
Two
Do
questions,
you want the
Ian.
microphone? No. Okay. Would you like the mic?
No. Two questions, Ian. One is, what would you do if you had the choice of changing it? And the second question is, I didn't really understand how you make them elected in the second chamber, but then keep the House of Lords to do the reviewing. Wouldn't the second chamber do the revising?
Yes, it would, but I think at the moment, what I'm suggesting is you keep try to have the best of all worlds, take a cake and eat it. So you still have it run on a part-time amateur low-cost basis with all the people having the expertise being there. But instead of being really appointed at the prerogative of the Prime Minister, which is largely what it is at the moment, and there has been a tremendous misuse of this patronage over recent years, new members would be voted on by the people in the sitting in the House of Commons at the moment. Now, a good parallel example is the Conservative Party, which, as we know, the membership in the country voted very differently from the MPs, which is one of the reasons we've got a bit of a problem at the moment. So I think that's really what I mean. But I also think it's probably fairly unlikely to happen. It is a bit theoretical, simply because the people there at the moment are never going to vote for it. But it's just a nice long-term ambition if there were to be any reform.
Thank you.
I think you need it, yeah.
Yes.
Jamie.
Two unrelated questions. From what you've said, it looks like the Foreign Secretary is unpaid. Is that the case?
The Foreign Secretary is paid, but if the Foreign Secretary of State is paid, the Foreign Minister of State is not paid. So David
So he
Cameron
gets his money from a different source, effectively.
Yes, it's a very distinguished Lord Ahmed, who's a wonderful peer. He is unpaid. He's the Minister of State. David Cameron's the Secretary of State. He is paid as a senior cabinet member. So it's slightly unusual to have Cameron in the Lords anyway. But
The second question, you appear to be fiercely anti-Rwanda bill.
yeah.
Why?
Well, simply because it's never going to work. Because the government, and if you think about it, very distinguished people have told the government over and over again that it's not going to work.
So
But it's one of these
a plane
things.
will not take off before the
The plane won't
4th of
take
July.
off. There'll be 10 lawyers at the end of the runway. It's just not going to happen. And Suella Braverman resigned over it. Robert Jenrick resigned over it. Lots of very distinguished crossbench peers who are all judges and real experts. It's not going to happen as long as we never made it lawyer-proof. But it's one of these things. I wish I could remember what it was called. There's a kind of management Harvard Business School sort of principle, something like the Peter principle, or the something syndrome. It's a syndrome whereby a manager, in this case the Prime Minister, has a fixed idea, and no matter how much people point out that it's flawed, they just stick to it in the hope that sooner or later it's going to work. So I think that's what's going to happen.
But he's going to have egg on his face big time if a plane doesn't take off before the 4th of July.
It's not going to take off before the 4th of July because the civil service is put into abeyance when there's a general election on. So it's impossible. But it's one of the reasons he wants the election now. He would always be able to say, oh yes, well, one would have taken off in August or September, whereas if he'd waited till the end of October, none had taken off. There'd be some serious egg on the face then. So it's a no-win, it's a least worst options scenario.
Were you surprised when the election was called so early?
Yes, I think everyone was really taken by surprise, especially MPs. I work very friendly and work a lot with a lot of MPs.
Mm-hmm.
And it was really unsatisfactory because none of them had really time to say goodbye or to their staff and to everybody there. The place was shut in 48 hours notice. And I think the only people who weren't taken by surprise were the Labour Party, because they had previously geared up for a May election, because they had a lead that we were going to have a May one. So they were all ready to go. And we've got, I think, 165 Conservative seats, which haven't been filled yet. Which isn't good.
That's scary.
But the other real reason for calling it now was to try to wrong foot reform, because we had focus groups which really put the fear amongst the leadership that it happened in the mayoral election in West Midlands, where Andy Street, who's very highly regarded, lost basically because reform took the votes. And if you add reform and the Conservatives, they're getting pretty close to the Labour figure. But they had scenarios and the focus groups and the modelling they do that if they waited till October, reform could really get some, because at the moment reform is quite disorganised in terms of its constituencies.
Right.
So that's the other.
So there was strategic thinking.
It was
certainly.
sort of panic strategic.
And panic. Okay. Ross.
How did you become a member of the Bombay Yacht Club?
Well, I lived in India for a very long time and wrote several books in India about India. And I just used to stay there. And one of the books I wrote was about Lord Byron's trip around the Mediterranean in his Royal Naval vessels, Lord Byron's Grand Tour from Plymouth to Istanbul and back. And I gave a lecture there a bit like this at the Royal Bombay Yacht Club. And the Commodore at the time was the only Indian at the time, it was quite a long time ago, who'd sailed solo around the world. And he was quite intrigued by this. And there's a very good bar, which we were talking about earlier, up on the first floor, which I'm responsible for several of the burgees hanging off it. And we both had a very entertaining evening, by which time he patted me on the shoulder and said, "You're an honorary life member." Because I reminded him over breakfast.
So you could come back and speak about Byron.
Yes.
It's his centenary, isn't it?
Yes.
This year. I had a quick question.
You mentioned that the House of Lords diversity level is roughly in accordance with the nation.
Yeah.
What do you define as diversity? Because there's an age, there's a wealth.
Yes,
there's
I'm
no
talking about,
issues.
yes.
What's your diversity definition? please?
Well, hasten to say it's not mine, it's the official House of Lords, but it's ethnic diversity.
Okay.
So the correct number of people of Afro-Caribbean, African and South Asian and East Asian.
But on age and wealth,
No,
not at
just
all.
pop luck, no.
Thank you.
No, unfortunately it's quite a shallow process. But some of them are actually really good. As indeed are a lot of the women, some very impressive women, some very bright young women MPs on the Conservative side, I'm sure on the Labour side, very bright. And I think when all this falls apart, there's a leadership election, some of those
Could come
bright
through.
young women MPs should be the next leader. Yeah.
Great. Tony.
You said that one of the better ways of electing members would be the Lords themselves elect members. Would that not be seen as rather bit of an old boys network inviting their friends to join?
No, because it would be done by secret ballot, and there would have to be an understanding that the candidates would have to be in proportion to what's in the House of Commons. So it would be combined with a whole lot of other reforms. One of the most sensible is that there's a 15-year term, because what happens is you get elected or appointed partly because you've got expertise in something, whether or not you've just been a judge or just been a publisher or whatever it is. And that holds good for a certain amount of time, but slowly over the years you kind of lose contact and you kind of go native as well. So you meet a lot of members there who've been for a long time, I mean like 40 years, but it's unusual, but there are. So I think it would be combined with a series of other reforms, and that's the very popular one people are talking about, is to have a 15-year time limit on being a member.
Yeah, I can certainly understand that for revitalising the input from
exactly.
industry and the like, so that they have become relevant to today's environment.
Yeah, exactly. And all the new industries coming along, I mean the tech industry, AI and all that sort of thing, you know, at the moment it's not really represented at all, but it would be, you know, that would be the plan. Yeah.
I think. Oh, sorry, Chris.
Yeah.
I see smile. Yes.
Putting aside hereditary peers for the moment, do you think the system whereby peers are made could be improved?
Yes, it could be improved if some patronage was taken away from the Prime Minister. But we've recently had a series of not particularly satisfactory appointments. So yes, and people are talking about this a lot, beefing up the House of Lords Appointments Commission, whose job is to vet some of them. I mean, Liz Truss, I think, had 12 candidates, and I think that got down to 4. So it does have
one every 3 days.
One last question. Here.
Slightly related, I was going to ask, can you buy yourself a seat in the House of Lords by being a political donor?
Yes. It's always been. Yeah.
That's clear.
How much have you got? Come and see me later. But I think it's got a bit more subtle since so much is open now with social media. I mean, you know, the days of Lloyd George, it was really just open, completely open. Now I think you probably got to do a little bit for charity as well and philanthropy. And I don't think you can anymore just give £1 million. Well, actually, it'd be a lot more than $1 million now. 10 million.
So would we not be better with taxpayer-funded parties?
Well, no, because that brings a whole lot of other problems with it. So I don't know the answer to that. It just seems that every time there's been any opinion poll, the public are just against spending any more money on it. So at the moment, the trades unions traditionally have bankrolled Labour, liberal Democrats by very rich, eccentric individuals, which is still the case, and conservative by business. I mean, it still holds true to a large extent, so it kind of does work. And actually, the abuses are quite seldom, and when they happen. So, for example, Labour peers are made from trade union leaders, and the unions have given the Labour Party money, a lot of money over the years, but ostensibly they're made peers because they've been head of the trade unions, not because of the money. And it's the same with, I'm thinking of one Conservative donor in particular, who's given I don't know, 10 million or so to the Conservative Party, has also given 100 million to various philanthropic causes. So it's kind of disguised.
It's getting quite expensive.
Ian, thank you
And
very
then they don't turn up because they're one of
don't
the
need
five,
to.
they don't need to, can't afford to.
I don't think that's the case. It was a much broader subject than I thought, I have to say. I just thought it was about wearing a lovely robe and
Well, there's that too.
all that sort of thing. Thank you for
Not at all.
explaining and sharing all that detail to us, and for coming all the way up from Bewley. And I know you're going back this evening, but you can stay and have supper with us.
That'd be nice,
But it
thank
was
you.
great. On behalf of all of us here and
Yeah,
members of
thank
the
you.
club, thank you so much, and we
Yeah.
can give you an application form.
Oh, right.
As if you need to have another club, a bit like all of us. But thank you very much. Great, so we're all set for supper, we're just in the room next door, so not far to go.
It's difficult to squeeze it into half an hour, which is why I got it. And I managed to do it in that sitting on the stool.